and Blacks in Science. He is Professor of Black Studies at Rutgers University. Please let's warmly welcome Dr. Ivan Van Sertima.
Both a pleasant and unpleasant announcement to make tonight. The unpleasant announcement is that I have a cold, and therefore I will have to speak in slow, measured tones in order to keep my voice going for the next hour. The pleasant announcement is that a week or two ago I got a letter from the Secretary General of UNESCO electing me to the International Commission to rewrite the history of mankind. In this letter, he mentioned that Sheikh Anta Diop had earmarked me as a man of great competence and experience, and in the light of his death, the death of Sheikh Anta Diop, I am being elected to the International Commission, and he'd asked me to pay a very close attention. There will be 7 major volumes on the scientific and cultural history of mankind, and that I'm to pay very close attention to all the sections dealing with African people. I shall certainly pay most close attention to those sections. Now, I had announced that I would be speaking on the Moors, but the Moor one broods on the influence and impact of Africa on Europe. The Moor one is aware that while you may concentrate on the Moors in a talk, you have to give a sense of the whole thing. You have to give a sense of the impact, the movement of the African into Europe over a much longer period of time. Because people could say afterward, oh yes, that was a flash in the pan, or oh yes, but who are the Moors? There was an African presence among the Moors, yes, but that was not of any great significance. European civilization was already formed, it had its own independent base, and even if they did have an impact, that was late in the day, too late to make much of a difference. Well, it wasn't too late in the day. And it made a difference, the African made a difference on European civilization much, much earlier than the Moors. In fact, Africa made an impact on Europe much, much earlier than European civilization itself. When Sheikh Anta Diop died, and Sheikh Anta Diop, for those of you who don't know him, and I have been here about 2 or 3 times this year, and none of you have been able to get hold of the book Great African Thinkers. It is in great demand, not just here, it's in great demand. The president of Senegal who asked for a copy. Madame Diop's wife, I got a letter from her a few days ago in which she said that she and her sons were amazed by the range and scope of the work dedicated to her late husband, and that she was deeply pleased by this. So this is also in very great demand now in France and in French-speaking countries. And those of you who do want to get a copy of this, please do so, because Sheikh Anta Diop is the greatest African thinker that lived in the 20th century. And his passing is a great blow to us. What is extraordinary, what is ironic, is that the day after he died, 12 Oxford scientists brought out a report in Nature. This is a very significant report because they announced that not only was man born in Africa, but modern man, the man that now occupies this planet, springs from an African population. In other words, the European now has been established by new studies, by new medical studies. It has now been established beyond the shadow of a doubt, both in studies in England as well as studies in Hawaii and California, the analysis of DNA polymorphisms, that all man on Earth springs from the African. And I'm not just talking about the beginnings of man. That's not terribly important. Everybody accepted for about the last 25 years that man was born in Africa. That in itself is not terribly important. Apes are born in Africa too. So people could say, yes, 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 and that's what they said when I was at university. Okay, man was born in Africa, but he was at a very, very low level stage. And when he went to Europe and Asia, he evolved at the highest stage. Whereas those who remained in Africa, they deteriorated or remained the same. And therefore, even though man was born in Africa, he left that stage a long, long time ago, at the level of, say, Homo erectus. The new studies show that all the stages of man, from the first to the very last, occurred in Africa, and that the last man, the very last stage, the stage that now occupies about 100 or 120,000 years ago, we have evidence of a man with the brain case, the sophisticated brain that we have now on this planet is in that African man who left last. He spread over the rest of the African continent, and he also spread out into Europe, and he spread out into Asia. Many people may ask, how did he spread out into Europe and Asia? Why would he go to the ice after the warmth of Africa? African man did not seek to go out into Europe. He went out because from where he originated, in eastern and southern Africa, where he found the last modern man, and in fact, in Hawaii and California, the University of Berkeley, it was announced that all human beings on this planet spring from a black woman that was in Africa about 120,000 years ago. So that after the Australopithecus boside, Australopithecus gracile, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo this and Homo that, then came the Neanderthal man, then comes the final man, which is Grimaldi man. Grimaldi man emerges in Europe. There are no Europeans in Europe. Now these are not studies by blacks, so nobody could say they are grinding a racial axe. These are the most conservative. These are people who have who had no respect for black history. These are the people making their announcements because their machines, their new eyes, their new windows on the world tell them beyond the shadow of a doubt, in an irrefutable way, there is no longer speculation on this matter. This is not theory now. This is what the study of DNA polymorphisms are saying. They have clues, molecular clues. Just like how you could check out the atom, they've now found something that goes beyond anything we knew before that tells us that modern man has an African ancestor. And this occurred, as I say, about 120,000 years ago, and it spreads out. Man was born longer than that, 3.5 million, but we're now talking about the last stage. Okay, not just man in a primitive or half-formed state, like Neanderthal man is not complete man. That's an African man too. He's not complete. He has the anterior lobe missing, the seat of the imagination. And then comes this man I'm speaking about, Homo sapiens sapiens. Neanderthal man, which precedes this final man, is known as Homo sapiens. But the last man is known as Homo sapiens sapiens. This is the man that is now in this room, whether he be white, black, or Asian. That man moved into Europe because from that point he started to migrate outwards. People were still at the hunting and gathering stage, and as they occupied certain territory and they exhausted their resources, they migrated, they moved forward, they spread out. So Africans spread out into Europe. Europe is only 20 miles from Africa. At its closest border, the southernmost border of Europe touches the northernmost border of Africa, is about 20 miles distant. So it was very easy to spread out into Europe. And then they also spread out into Asia. Asia at that time did not, it was joined by a landmass to Africa, and they spread out into parts of Western Asia. So you find the black man in all the early civilizations of the world. You find even in China, we have the dynasty of the Shang. I don't want to talk about China today, but I must mention this as we're talking about early civilizations and the spread of the black man. We find the Shang dynasty, when it was defeated by the Chu said that the Shang people were very, very black. These were black, and you also find the first emperor in China being called a black man. You find this even among early traditions of the Japanese, where they speak of the samurai, the most revered type in Japan. They said in order to be a samurai, you must have a bit of black blood. I wish Nakasoba remembered that. But in Europe, we have something unusual occurring. We have an ice age known as the warm interstadial, and during that period, African man begins to mutate. First of all, he throws up the albino. The albino is a man with the morphology of the Africans, but he has no pigmentation. Now his hair color is different, his eye color is different, his skin color is different, all three related to pigmentation. Pigmentation was absolutely vital in the tropic and subtropical regions because we need the screen to protect us from heavy and intense ultraviolet radiation. In the ice, however, this was not necessarily an advantage. In the ice, African man began to suffer because instead of having abundant sunlight pouring into him, you have separation from the sun on many levels. First of all, the sun in the tropics is very different from the sun in the temperate zone. Where I was born, the sun is a powerful light. At noon, you cannot lift your eyes to the sky. You will be blind in a minute. We automatically walk with a slight movement downwards of the head between 12 and 2, because you cannot raise your eyes to the sky. It's a huge ball of fire, silver fire in the sky. I was born in the center of the world. So it is not like the sky, it's not like the light you have here. And so separation from that light, and then further separation in caves, then separation by having to cover himself in ice with animal skins most of the year in order to protect himself from the cold. All of these things led to problems with mineralization of the bones. Certain things could not be sustained in the ice. Hence you find the albino type becoming a mutation that is advantageous and selective, so that you have that turning into the Cro-Magnon type. Slight morphological changes then begin to occur over 10,000 years, where you have contraction of features in the ice. Ice tends to contract, heat tends to expand. So we have expansive features among sun people and contracted features among ice people. So that accounts for the narrowing of the nose, the slight differences in jaw structure, etc., which you would get in extreme ice forms. This is not the case today. In other words, a black cannot turn into white or a white turn into black, okay? Because those are extreme conditions over a long period of time. Ice covered in parts of Europe to the depth of 1 mile. So we're talking about the extreme conditions. We're not talking about merely people in the temperate zone turning slowly over centuries into pigmentless types. In fact, the climatological shift that is now occurring in the world is likely to bring about black types rather than white types, because we have a hole in the ozone layer, as a result of which the ultraviolet radiation of the earth is increasing. So that instead of having situations which you had in the ice age, in which ultraviolet radiation moves away from certain parts or is very weak in certain parts, now you have ultraviolet radiation breaking through the Arctic, thereby likely to produce a slightly different kind of change, perhaps even mutation. Because we have found within recent times that the increase in skin cancer among whites is 20%. It is quite radical, it is quite extraordinary. Nobody tells you about this because it's very frightening. I learned about it when I was in the space program studying blacks in space science, and fell upon a black scientist in the astrophysics lab who had sent up 2 balloons with laser machines he had invented to test the ozone layer. And he was a young man, brilliant, but probably because he knew I was interviewing him for a book. He said more than he had a right to say, because these lasers are not only used to test these things, some of them have military uses. So when I went to visit him the next time, I was arrested. And I was quite surprised, but I said to myself, this arrest can't last long. In fact, people who arrest me are going to look like fools. So they asked me, who sent you here? And I said, NASA. And they said, who at NASA? And I called the name Curtis Graves, and they checked it out, and they found, in fact, Curtis Graves was in Libya. He was on a mission, a secret mission. So I no longer had my backup, so they put me in a cell, and they said, you keep quiet, we'll call the British Embassy and check you out, because you're a foreigner. We don't know why you're here. So I said, and I called the name of the guy who had done this work. It's a black scientist. And I said, he told me to come and interview him. And they called him, he said, no, he doesn't know anything about me. Well, I know he was trying to save his job. So that was quite a dilemma, but I said to myself, this is interesting. I mean, so I didn't take it too seriously. In a matter of fact, within an hour's time, they found everything was all right, so they let me in. But they would not allow me to speak with him on his own. There was another scientist with him, and every time I asked him a question, he would turn to his senior scientist to see whether he could answer. And if he said anything, the other man would modify what he said, so I never used it. But one thing he told me in private, before we got into that situation, he said that this is a very, very serious matter. In 75 years, if that ozone layer opens up, if that hole opens up, people who do not have pigmentation screens will die like albinos died in Africa. They will have a shorter life. Now that is nothing to rejoice about. I'm merely mentioning it because I want you to be aware that nature has its odd way of going through various sequences. But let us move from the origin of man for a moment. The important thing there is to understand that Europe was originally occupied by black people. And not all of them died out. Even when the Grimaldi type was replaced by the Cro-Magnon type, several explorers found black people in strange places. They found blacks in Ireland, for example. Blacks controlled Tory Island in Ireland. We have a black king in Ireland at one stage called Gorman. We find blacks among the Vikings. We found powerful Vikings like Thorhall the Hunter, Thorstein, who were regarded as tall black giants. They were much taller than the ordinary Swede. When Eric the Red entered Greenland, he found blacks among the other people. When the Romans entered Britain and defeated the British, that is the Anglo-Saxon type, they were started to find, they said, many of the people look like Ethiopians. So that even for a long time after the final black type Grimaldi began to change, albanize and alter in pigmentation as well as morphology over thousands of years, you still have surviving types among the white types because they're all Homo sapiens sapiens. Okay? However, our great concern is not so much with very early man. Our great concern is the impact on civilization, because people could say, okay, so there were blacks in Britain and there were blacks in Ireland and there were blacks in these places. But what influence did they have? Were they just after Cro-Magnon man, that is the Caucasoid man, emerged? Were these people relevant? Were these people significant? Did they leave any impact on Europe? They did. The blacks had tremendous influence and made an impact on Greece. And that's a place called Crete. You will see a black priest in Crete when you see the slides tonight. You will see black people with boats. These are people long before Christ. This is preceding Greek civilization now. You will see them going about in their great boats. You will see them at war. You will see them in the hunt. This is from Crete. Crete was to move in. Many people came out of Crete and affected Greek civilization. So Greek civilization was not only affected later by the Egyptians, it was also affected by the Cretans. And Evans and Schliemann, those people who had excavated Crete, pointed out that the ancestors of the Cretans were largely black. These are people, once again, who were even startled by what they found. I am pretty sure that Oxford scientists, knowing Oxford as I do, were quite startled when they found that they could no longer argue with their machines. The impact of Egypt on Greece is something that has been dealt with many times by many people. Let me just point to three aspects. One of them is absolutely new. This startles even me. And I thought I had known enough about it not to be surprised. But to my great surprise, in December of last year, I received a letter from a young black mathematician in Philadelphia, Ted Irwin. Ted Irwin presented to me the Xerox of something he'd taken from a book called Mathematical Recreations. In 1932, a Dutch scientist, a Dutch mathematician, Dr. Keerder, discovered something astonishing. They found on the sarcophagus of an Egyptian in the step pyramid at Saqqara, built by the black genius Imhotep, they discovered a stone. People had looked at this stone many times, but they had not noticed that it was how significant it was, because on this stone were snakes, formed things in the form of snakes, and there was a harp player, etc. And they did not take this as very important. They did not understand what it was. After he began to look at it, and you will get a chance to see it tonight, it's our last slide. What did you think he discovered? He discovered that all the decimal numbers we're using today, which some of us call Arabic numerals, and some of us, even myself, thought to be Hindu numerals that the Arabs had brought into Europe during the Moorish civilization, had actually been created 2,900 years before Christ by the Egyptians. The decimal numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all those had been created by the blacks in Egypt 2,900 BC. But we never suspected this because the general Egyptians were using other ciphers. This was held by a secret society of Egyptians. Imhotep and a few people knew about it. And there is no question about the date. And do you know, although that was discovered about 60 years ago, nearly 60 years ago, announced in 1932, nobody said a word about it. It's right there in this book. It's sitting on page 311. There is absolutely no question about it. It's more than 1,000 years before the Hindu picked it up. And Thutmose III had carried this over into Asia when Thutmose conquered 110 cities in Asia. And there was never a word about it. That is one of the astonishing things that we are discovering now. That when Sheikh Antioch was taking skins off the mummies in the Museum of Man, Diop told me when I was in England in 85, Diop said, do you know that when I was taking off the skin to study it in my lab, I discovered other people had already taken off skin? Yet nobody had said a word. In other words, some people had actually found out what he was to find out later, but they never said a word about it. It is very important. That is the reason why we have to be very educated about these things. Because after a period of time, if you're not vigilant, things that we have discovered now, 50 years from now, we may be told, that's not true. Where did you get that from? I never heard of that. It is very important. It is very important. Now I have to get close to the mic, I understand. It is very important that this knowledge, which is not just being hooted about in words, this knowledge is now captured in journals, it's captured in books. Every year, since 1979, after I finished They Came Before Columbus, I have edited 1 or 2 books a year. I am now on my 14th book, which comes out on June 30th. There's Africans in early Europe, Africans in early Asia, which is being revised and expanded to include Japan and other parts of the world. There's Africans in early America, which comes out in June. There is there is Egypt Revisited. There's Nile Valley Civilizations. There is Great African Thinkers. There are books on African presence in the art of the Americas. There's a whole range of books. Black women in antiquity, etc. You are not to go without these things. It is not enough to make hollow boasts or outlandish statements about what blacks did in history. It is important that you should know the facts. If some of you learned the Bible by heart, most of our mothers or grandmothers or grandfathers learned the Bible by heart. Why shouldn't we learn our history by heart? There are certain people among us, and I needn't name them. You ask them about anything in their history, they will recite you page, chapter, and verse. We have to learn to do that, because that is a protection, a tremendous protection against the loss of our past. The loss of that past, the inability to present and project it in such a way as to give us a certain strength during the years of our fragmentation and disunity and loss. Those are the things that kept us away from this kind of internal strength that we are now beginning to recover and revive. The Egyptians gave us the calendar. The first people to invent the 365 and a quarter day year were the Egyptians. It went up into Europe. They were the first people to cut the year into 365 and a quarter days. They dealt with the quarter differently. After 1,460 years, they created a leap year. Around 300 BC, when the Greeks came in, they changed that. You have also the Africans creating the exact calculation of the year into 12 months of 30 days each. They had 5 festival days. December the 25th, which we now celebrate as the Day of the Christ, Africans created that day. They were the first people to celebrate December the 25th as the Day of the Christ. Jesus was not born. Jesus is the last and perhaps the most powerful of the Christ figures. But the Christ figure was already in Africa. Christ is an African word. It's K-R-S-T, Christ of Christ. That's an Egyptian word meaning the anointed one, the revered one. And that exists in Africa. The figure that was being worshipped as the Christ was Horus. Horus, the mother of Horus was Isis. We have found, Bruce Williams, Keith Seal discovered that in Nubia, on the edge of the Sudan, the place called Kustal, they discovered a pharaonic civilization where Horus the Christ is already in existence. This is 200 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. We have discovered these figures in Ta-Seti, a civilization known as Ta-Seti, which precedes the Egyptian by at least 2 centuries. All of these things, these ideas, these concepts are carried over. The first image of Christ, the first physical image of Christ is not of a European at all. On the coin of Justinian II in the 2nd century AD, we could see a bronze Christ with woolly hair, just like he appears in Revelation. He is not a European. And we could look down the history of Egypt, of Greece and Egypt, and we could see a vast number of things carried forward from the African world into Europe. Look at the goddesses in Europe. Isis, the great African goddess, the mother of the Christ figure Horus, is carried right through Europe. Every major European power, Rome, Greece, even as far as the British Isles, you find them worshipping Isis. That is how the Black Madonnas began. And initially the Black Madonna has African features. It is only later that she's changed into European woman, but she keeps the black skin. And then they try to explain it away by saying they fell into fires, or that is the suit of the ages, or some such thing, or that's just a ritual color. And the first representation of Jesus in the arms of Mary is that of the Black Madonna and Child. In fact, for centuries, the only image of the mother of Jesus and of Jesus is that of a black woman with a black child. That is throughout the world. Many many queens, many princesses coming out of the Ethiopian world were carried into the European world. We find, for example, you have, I have to pause for a moment. We have Andromeda, who had Jason win the Golden Fleece. Andromeda is one of the great figures in the pantheon of the Greeks. Andromeda marries Perseus. This is a black woman. She's represented as a black woman in Greece. Medea is represented as a black woman. Andromeda, married Perseus. Medea helped Jason win the Golden Fleece. Both are represented as black women. Circe appears in the Odyssey as a black. She's on the Greek vases as a black woman. She's the one who tempted the crew of Odysseus. Artemis, the goddess of chastity, appears as a black woman. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, appears as a black woman. These are actual black women in the world who turn into mythical figures in the European world. Even Zeus, the great god Zeus, comes out of that world of the black and is taken into Europe. Those are the gods and goddesses they worship. Professor Scobie, who is here tonight, and to whom the book African Presence in Early Europe is dedicated, has shown us the profound influence of the blacks on the religion of the Europeans. There were 3 black popes in Rome. There is Pope Victor, Pope Gelasius, and there is Pope Miltiades. Let me speak of Pope Miltiades and you will see his face in the slides. Pope Miltiades is a very important pope. He reigned between 311 and 314 AD. He's tremendously important because during his reign, the Roman Emperor Constantine became converted to Christianity. The Christians were being fed to the lions. The Christians were persecuted. Their property had been seized. But it is when the black man, Miltiades, was Pope of Rome, that the Romans were converted, at least their emperor, and the property of the church was given back to the black Miltiades. The Pope knows that. The Catholics know that. They had his picture in the Sistine Chapel. Where is it now? They represent him as a white man, just as they represent Christ as having blue eyes and blonde hair. As Reverend Daughtry was saying on his tape just before this lecture began,
what profound psychological impact it would have had on the world if Christ was represented as he was first represented. If that mother and child was seen as was seen then, he was seen here today, it would have made a tremendous difference. We could not have been treated the way we were treated. And we could not have grown to think of ourselves the way we have grown to think of ourselves. But it is not simply with the Ethiopians and with the Egyptians that the impact on Europe became so great. Carthage presented something else. How many of you have heard of the great city of Carthage and of the Carthaginians? It is true that there are certain stages in Carthaginian history when whites were in power. There's a Greek Carthage, there's a Roman Carthage. We're not speaking of those later periods. We speak of the period in which the greatest of them all, the greatest of the Carthaginians, was in power, Hannibal. They have been back to the graves of Carthage during the time of Hannibal. They have made a study of what Carthage was like in the time of Hannibal. Do you know what they found? They found in the graves, when they dug the graves, Gazelle and others, they found that the predominant type, 95% of the people, not just the common people, but the ruling class is African. They compare it with the so-called Phoenician type in Lebanon, in Tyre, in Sidon, in those cities. In Byblos, they look in the graves and they find it's a different type. It is African. And don't tell me you can't tell what an African is. Sometimes in the graves, looking at skeletons, where populations have become mixed, you can get confused. But here, the brow ridge, the nasal ridge, the canine foci, the whole thing, the structure, everything shows clearly you're dealing with an African. And it doesn't end there. You could say, all right, perhaps we made a mistake. The coin struck by the Romans after they were defeated by the great armies of Hannibal shows Africans on one side and elephants on the other. Do you know how they deal with that one? They say the people on the back of the elephants were riding the elephants. On the back of the coin, in other words, to celebrate, they're celebrating the riders, the elephant riders. In that time, only kings and gods and goddesses were on coins. But suddenly, because a black appears, he's not a god, obviously, because he's black. He's not a king, obviously, because he's black. Hence, he must have been the rider of the elephant. That is one of the great victories and one of the greatest strategies. You cannot become a general anywhere in the world without studying the strategies of Hannibal. Hannibal advanced with a largely African army across the earth. You cannot imagine what that means. Do you know what it is for Africans coming out of the tropics to go into the ice for 1 year, taking elephants as cavalry, going right through those steep precipices, going through the Po Valley, fighting skirmishes with the Europeans all the time on their way, until the Europeans begin to admire them to such an extent that when they reached the doors of Rome, do you know Europeans joined with them to defeat their own Europeans? You know why? Because the Romans to them were not just white people. They joined with the blacks to defeat their own whites because Rome was an imperial power. Some of them wanted to escape the imperialism of Rome. And hence they were prepared when they saw for the first time someone could successfully challenge Rome. They joined with Hannibal. Hannibal sent an army forward. This is where the Romans, the greatest European power, owning the whole world, having control over the greater part of the known world. There were only two powers fighting over the Mediterranean. The black and Phoenician power known as Carthage and the white power known as Rome. And they thought for a moment that this was what the army was. So the Romans advanced. Hannibal's army then retreated swiftly, and the Romans thought it was a quick victory. But Hannibal had not really committed his army. He committed a part of the army to trick the Romans into advancing. So the Romans, instead of stopping and saying, well, why are these people running away from us without a fight? The Romans ran straight ahead, and he had two pincer movements. And as the Romans advanced, the pincer movements closed in. And when the Romans realized they were in a trap, they sounded the retreat. And as they retreated, they saw the elephants at the back. So they had the pincer movements on the side. The retreating army then began to advance, and the elephants came on that side, and they were caught in a trap. 55,000 Romans died on that day. That was the end of the Roman army. The Africans dealt a blow to the greatest European power that they took 10 years to recover from. That's the Battle of Cannae. It's very important to note that what defeated the Africans was treachery. Other Africans in Africa, an ambitious African, Scipio Nasica, trained at the same academy, military academy, as Hannibal, he did him in. Because Hannibal called on his brother Hasdrubal to come and bring reinforcements up into Europe so he could sustain the ground he had won. But Hasdrubal was murdered, and he was not able to sustain that ground. It is not only the coins that were struck, it is not only the skeletons in the graves, but studies have been done of culture. They found the pick. The first use of the pick is in Carthage. Well, what is the European doing with the pick? If these are not Africans, if these are other types, what are they doing with the pick? They looked at their hairstyles, they looked at their veils, they looked at their food, they looked at their desserts, they looked at their decorations, they looked at their jewelry, they looked at their custom, they looked at their ritual, they looked at their language. African, 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 dominant African. Yet they say they're not sure. This is unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. It's like at the United Nations. That was the one thing that the Secretary General of UNESCO said in his letter to me. There have been great complaints. That's why they're revising the history. There have been great complaints that Africa's been left out of the writing of its own history. There have been great complaints that this is a Eurocentric history. But I am very happy that I have a chance to revise it. That is the beginning of something new. I shall certainly make full use of all that I know to help rewrite that history. Now to the Moors. As I say, there have been many movements into Europe by Africans, but the Moorish thing is very, very important. It is important because it's the last great movement into Europe by Africans before the slave trade. It is important because it made possible, to a large extent, the Industrial Revolution. Many of us are not aware of the impact on the Industrial Revolution made by the Africans and the Arabs and the Asiatic types who were touched by the Muslim invasion and also brought their genius up into Europe. What we consider European technology, European civilization, is really world civilization, in which we have a major part, in which we have played a very major role. In 711 AD, the attack was made against Europe. But we cannot begin in 711 AD, we have to begin with Muhammad. Arabia was originally a black country. It did not remain so. In the time of Muhammad, it was not a black country. 10% of it was black. Other peoples had come in, Asiatics to a large extent. the so-called Semitic type, though it's difficult to define what Semitic means. But nevertheless, Asians had entered, different type. The Arabian type was different from the African type. Black blood, yes, but nevertheless different. Okay, let me use the word Arabian so that you don't get confused with the word Arab. Because Arab is not a race, okay? You have black Arabs, you have blue-eyed Arabs. It's just like the Jew. There are black Jews, and in fact, in the early stages, they're nothing but black Jews. When the Jews left Egypt, they were speaking Egyptian. You can live in a country, a small minority, for 400 and something years and come out of it speaking anything else. Let me pause for a moment. One is not trying, bear in mind, to run down the Jews because we are part of that. We have been pushed out of that legacy, but in fact, the further you go back into early Jewish history, you find a lot of blacks. The Jews were not a race. They were persecuted by the Egyptians, also our people, because it was a sect that at one stage was so very different from most of the other people around it, that like most sects that are different from the general thing, it's persecuted. It wasn't persecuted because it was a race. The Jews left Egypt, but they were to come back to Egypt in many ways. Jesus was educated in Egypt. When the trouble started with Herod, where did you think they sent Jesus? To Egypt, the home, where he could be protected, where he could be educated. That is why the Bible says, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He came back to perform his mission. And many Jews believe that he couldn't be the true Messiah. Some people have actually said, some Jews have actually said that Jesus was an Essene, that is, he was affected by that Egyptian religion. I don't want to go into that because Jesus was an extraordinary individual. Whatever he may have grown up among, whatever sect, etc., like Muhammad, who transcended the limitations of the Arab, Jesus transcended the limitations of any sect or any group. Jesus was an extraordinary individual. It is because of his uniqueness that he's become universal. The same thing is true of Muhammad. Jesus was crucified because of disagreements among his own people. When Pontius Pilate said, this man is innocent, why don't you have Barabbas? The Jews said, no, we want Jesus. I'm not attacking the Jews, I'm just pointing out that it is a tribe or a sect or a race is not what determines finally the power of a prophet. That is why we cannot get involved in things about Muhammad is such and such a race or Jesus is such and such a race. He belongs to all human people. What is sad is when one people conquering another people takes their prophet or takes the prophet which is not theirs, whom they've helped to crucify and defile, and then put this prophet in their own image and sell it to us, as though God has suddenly decided to turn up in the face of those who have oppressed us, in the form of those who oppressed us. That is the reason why we have to know our history, or this is the sort of